first presentation, which will look at proliferation financing. What do we mean by proliferation financing when we talk about this? So the outline of the session will look at proliferation financing, what is covered by the term proliferation financing, and what is really contained in the scope of this concept that is used at the FATF level. We will also be talking about briefly international legal requirements about it, and then we will go through some typologies that will help you understand what proliferation financing means. Apologies. Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties just because our slides are in Khmer. So I just need to make sure that I'm on the right slides. So do bear with us. Great. So when we talk about proliferation, first of all, I want to break it down a little bit and not go straight to proliferation financing. When we talk about proliferation, we are really talking about the development and use of weapons of mass destruction. So weapons of mass destruction includes nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and also the delivery systems, such as missiles that are used to deliver those weapons to the target. And the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is prohibited by several international treaties. We've got the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we've got the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention. That means that no country is allowed to develop these weapons. And therefore, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is an international security threat and is a priority for the international community to combat. And therefore, it is so great to see so many on the call today dialing in to understand how you, whether you work for a bank or an estate agent or an accountancy firm in Cambodia, how you can contribute to countering the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. It's worth pointing out that proliferation is not just the selling or the development of a complete weapons of mass destruction system. It can include anything from the manufacture and the production of those systems, the possession, the acquisition, or the stockpiling of those systems, the transportation, the sale, the transfer, the export or transshipment. And this is where financing would fall into that category. So even if you're not the buyer or the seller of weapons of mass destruction, proliferation can still include the transportation, sale, financing, transfer of those items. And it also includes technical training or any advice and assistance that is linked to the proliferation. So even if it's not a physical trait that is provided, technical training and knowledge is also considered as part of proliferation. And as I mentioned, we have these international conventions that seek to prohibit and counter the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The UN Security Council has imposed sanctions to prevent and counter the further spread of weapons of mass destruction. And these sanctions that have been passed by the international community through the UN Security Council also includes the financing of proliferation. Great. So what is proliferation financing? And that is really the core of the training today. We're looking at the financing and the financial aspect of proliferation. Financing is quite key when it comes to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. it is really the thing that facilitates the movement and the development of mass destruction programs. It's what makes this possible for regimes. Just like you and I need a bank account and access to financial services throughout our lifetime in order to buy things in the international marketplace or in order to survive, so does proliferators need access to financing in order to procure and develop weapons of mass destruction. And the Financial Action Task Force, the international standard setter on issues of financial crime, in 2010, they provided a working definition for proliferation financing that I think provides a good starting point for our session today in order to understand what we mean by proliferation financing. The Financial Action Task Force outlines proliferation financing as the act of providing funds or financial services that are used in whole or in part for various purposes, and they're listed on your slide here, but it includes manufacturing, possession, export, transport, stockpiling, or the use of weapons of mass destruction, so the categories that I outlined already, in contravention of national laws or, where applicable, international obligations. So here, really, the Financial Action Task Force is saying that financial services connected to the materials, the technologies that go into weapons of mass destruction counts as proliferation financing. So that's the first thing I want to look at. I want to look at the purchase of sensitive goods, which is perhaps at the core of proliferation financing. This is something that is not specific to any individual proliferation actor. So throughout the day, you might hear references to certain countries that are currently under specific sanctions by the United Nations Security Council for their proliferation efforts. But really, the purchase of sensitive goods, of any goods or materials that can be used in a weapons of mass destruction program, that is really not connected to any specific actor. No actor at any place or any time are allowed to purchase these. So proliferators have been known to procure weapons of mass destruction relevant technology, materials, and expertise from around the world, and they need financial channels in order to be able to do this. Countries who already have civil nuclear programs, so nuclear energy programs in their country, or countries with a high-tech or dual-use industries are particularly at risk because they have produced goods that are particularly relevant to weapons of mass destruction, and therefore proliferators want to get their hands on those goods. And therefore, it's important that if you have any clients, or if you interact with any supply chains that include what we call weapons of mass destruction relevant technologies, that you take special care to understand where the goods are going, so the destination of those goods, whether the materials that are being shipped could potentially be used for the development of weapons of mass destruction. And this is where it gets very tricky, because we have dual-use items, and these actually mean that it's items that can both be used in a refrigerating unit, but also be used as a cooling unit for a weapons of mass destruction program, for example. And often what we're seeing is that the procurement of materials is geographically separated from the financial payment trail. So even if we have payments that are being used to pay for certain technologies, you might have the goods being sent from jurisdiction A to jurisdiction C, going via jurisdiction B, but the financial trail might actually start in a completely different jurisdiction, jurisdiction D, and end up in jurisdiction X. And therefore, even if you're part of the financial trail, even if you don't think that you are in a country where there is a high-tech or dual-use goods industry, or even if you don't have clients that are directly involved in these industries, it's still important to pay attention to it, because you could be part of the financial trail. So there are lists of goods that can help you determine if certain goods are relevant to weapons of mass destruction. We've listed the different lists below here in the box on your slide. The first one is the nuclear suppliers group, which contains information on nuclear materials and technology, including dual-use items. But there are also others that are more specific. For example, the Missile Technology Control Regime, which the name gives it away, focuses on missile technology. There is the Wassenaar Arrangement, which looks at conventional arms trade and some dual-use goods. And then we have others looking specifically at biological weapons, or others looking specifically at the technology needed into the production of fissile nuclear material. So different aspects makes up our export control regime, and any of these items should not be financed or being provided financial services for. However, if it was only this easy, and trust me, it will get more complicated as we go through the session, if only it was this easy. Sometimes minor differences in the specification of items can make a very big difference. So something might be controlled if it's 5 millimeters thick, but not be controlled if it's 4 millimeters thick. And these subtle nuances makes it very easy for proliferators to procure items that fall just below or just above control thresholds. But it also makes it incredibly difficult for private sector implementers to detect these subtle differences and to know if something is controlled or not controlled. And in many cases, a specific export control good will not give you a definite indication that something is a controlled good and that something can't be financed. It's also worth noting that proliferators are aware of which items are controlled, and if they know that there is increased scrutiny around those items, they might seek to procure or declare something else on the financial payment. So they might declare something else on a letter of credit, for example, that doesn't actually correspond to the good that's being sent. It's also worth noting that the United Nations has passed a specific resolution related to North Korea, which prohibits financial transactions or financial services or making resources available to anything that could contribute to North Korea's nuclear-related programs, weapons of mass destruction-related programs, ballistic missile-related programs, weapons of mass destruction delivery systems, or the operational capabilities of North Korea's armed forces. So really draws out the definition quite widely and really allows the particular state to determine what might be a controlled good and what might be considered a controlled good when it comes to a specific country. Great. So I'm going to just stop my share for a brief moment. And Wojtek, I'm not sure if you can pick up the slideshow from where I left off, because then we can get it in full screen. But what I will say is that so far I haven't really been talking about targeted financial sanctions. And that's because the procurement of these sensitive goods and items, of course, no one who is subject to sanctions, no entity or individual who's subject to sanctions should be able to procure them. But it really is also about any party. There are international agreements that prohibits anyone around the world from procuring such items. Okay, so if we can get the slides back up, I will continue from where I left off. Wonderful. That should be showing up better on your screen now. Apologies for the slightly small size of the slides before. This is perfect. Great. But proliferation financing is also more than just the payments or the financial services that are directly connected to the procurement of goods and the development of weapons of mass destruction. Proliferation financing can also include designated entities and individuals who have been specifically designated by the United Nations Security Council and who's the topic of our training today. It can also include the raising of funds and revenue generating activities by designated entities and individuals in order to fund their proliferation efforts. And it can also include the financial and corporate networks and any financial services that sustain these activities. And on your screen, we've included a diagram that demonstrates this. If we only focus on the financial products and services related to trade in proliferation sensitive goods, we're not likely to pick up very much proliferation financing activity. Designated entities and individuals, who are the topic of our training today, are involved in loads of other financial activities that are also prohibited. And the requirements, as we will outline in a moment, is about not making assets or financial services available to those designated entities and individuals. And those entities and individuals are not always going to be buying sensitive goods and materials, but will actually be involved in a lot of other financial activities. So therefore, it's important that we take a broader approach when we look at what proliferation finance might encompass. It's also worth noting that we have a lot of banks on the call today dialing in for the training, but we also have a lot of other sectors. We have a lot of DNFBPs, designated non-financial businesses and professions, such as estate agents, accountants, lawyers, casinos even. And estate agents, lawyers, accountants, casino owners might think, well, actually, I don't have anything to do with prohibited goods or missile components or anything to do with materials that are usable in a nuclear weapons program. So it is important that we take this broader scope and acknowledge that designated entities and individuals who are involved in proliferation will have a broader financial and corporate network and access to broader financial services and do fundraising and revenue raising through the letting of property or through money laundering through a casino or by setting up companies through a company service provider with the help of a lawyer or an accountant. All of these services, if they're connected to the designated entity, is also considered proliferation financing. Great, I'll go to the next slide. So I think it's also worth revisiting the FATF's definition that I brought up on the screen before. You will notice that the FATF refers to funds or financial services. And here we're not just talking about a financial payment. So me sending a financial transaction to Wojtek, that is not just what we're talking about. Actually, the definition of what funds and financial services covers is a lot broader at the FATF level. So on the next slide, you will see an overview of the FATF's definition of funds and other assets. And I will say this is paraphrased. So if you want the precise definition, you need to look on FATF's website. But according to the FATF, funds and other assets means any financial assets, any economic resources. I'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by economic resources, property of any kind. So this really is where it gets relevant for estate agents. So if designated entities and individuals have access to property, that is actually considered part of their funds and financial assets that should be restricted to them and be frozen. We also have legal documents or instruments of any kind that evidence a title to or an interest in funds and other assets. So by that, I mean bank credits, traveler checks, bank checks, money orders, shares, securities, bonds, or letters of credit. And banks won't be involved in all of this. It actually involves many other industries who have obligations when it comes to the implementation of targeted financial sanctions against proliferators and therefore the implementation of proliferation financing controls. And then it says at the bottom, any other assets which can be used to obtain funds, goods, or services. So really here, this is where your imagination can run wild. If you offer a product or if you provide a service that can be considered a way to obtain a fund or goods or service, for example, cryptocurrencies has recently been looped in with the Financial Action Task Force because cryptocurrencies evidences a way to obtain funds or evidence ownership in some funds. So that is also covered. So let's talk a little bit more about economic resources as well. So specifically for the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the United Nations Sanctions Committee has defined that vessels, so maritime vessels, ships, should be considered economic resources and are therefore also subject to asset freezing actions. And the UN actually maintains a list of designated vessels that are designated in their own right and should also be considered a designated party and entity. So further than that, if we 2 clicks on the slides should get us to this. Economic resources also includes commodities, including oil, coal. It includes goods and equipment that for any purpose, because goods and equipment has a value that can be used or resold. It also includes precious metals and stones and perhaps others. And this is where domestic legal frameworks really come into play, because they will define what is meant by economic resources. But all this to say that the definition of proliferation financing is incredibly broad. And if you came into this training today thinking proliferation financing is only to do with the payment that is connected to someone buying a missile or someone buying a component that can be used in a nuclear weapons program, I'm hoping that the last few slides have given you an indication that actually the definition of proliferation financing goes beyond that. And the types of things that we need to look for when it comes to designated entities and individuals is a bit further, is further than that and has a broader scope. It can include their property. It can include the insurance of a vessel that is designated. It can include a letter of credit for a completely unrelated service, but because that letter of credit is ultimately connected to a designated party and entity, it can be considered proliferation financing. So I'm hoping this provides some useful context. I also talked a little bit about financial and corporate infrastructure. And on the next slide, I just want to talk briefly about that. Designated persons and entities are prohibited from accessing the financial system. So if you are on a sanctions list, you are not only not allowed, you will have your assets frozen, but you will also be prohibited from accessing the financial system. And in the next session, we'll talk a little bit about what's encompassed and what an asset freezing order involves. But it's worth noting that designated persons and entities, anyone on a sanctions list, they know that they are designated. So they will always mask their presence through the use of third-party intermediaries and front companies. If your name is on a sanctions list, you are unlikely to do business on your own. And this is where financial and corporate infrastructure becomes so important to understand how that could be a part of proliferation financing as well. Because services like trust and company service providers, legal services, accountants are all key to the formation of companies, and are therefore also all key to the formation of front company networks. And even though the formation of companies is a completely legitimate undertaking, we need to be aware that designated entities and parties who are on the sanctions list will also make use of the same processes to set up companies and be able to operate in order to still be able to access the financial system. They're not going to say, oh, my name is on a sanctions list, I'll just stop doing business. No, they're going to find a way around that. So the rest of the presentation, which will be delivered by Sasha, focuses on the ways in which designated entities and individuals seek to circumvent international controls to still gain access to the international financial system. So I'll hand over to Sasha. I do want to apologize for the slight difficult technicalities at the beginning of my presentation. I promise that we're now fully on track and we are here to deliver this training, and I think this is the end of our technical difficulties. Thanks for bearing with us.
Great, thank you very much.